Today we're going to be taking a coffee break together to discuss how can we turn post-traumatic stress into post-traumatic growth. And I like the title of Can the Phoenix Still Rise? Now, as a disclaimer before I start, because we're talking about some traumatic things that we collectively went through, please, if any one of you feels triggered at any time point, ideally, I would have said, please reach out to me at the end of the session. But I'm still going to venture and say the same. You have my email, phone number. If I can be of any help, I really do not want you to take with any possible distress the talk might give. Knowing that we're going to be focusing on growth much more than trauma, since sometimes talking about. So here's how we thought the conversation would go. I'm going to tell you a bit about stress and what is post-traumatic stress. So the combo of both. Then I'm going to tell you why other scientists and physicians also think be emphasizing rather than just saying. I'm going to show you a series of small research experiments we've done in Lebanon for the past couple of years, so that the findings hopefully resonate with something that you have lived. And at the end, I will tell you why we care so much about post-traumatic. Now, I bear many hats, two of which are clinical psychologist and an assistant professor at MIT, and the other one is a neuroscientist. So sometimes, actually most of the times, I do tend to inject some slides related to the brain and neuroscience in my talk. I'll make it super easy, I promise, especially at 5 p.m. If there's anything that is not clear, please stop me. So you all know who the field is, and you all know that we as Lebanese are typically methodically said to constantly write from our actual practice. Now, what's specific about the Phoenix that it does so well, quote unquote, under stress. So basically, there are two sides of the coin. One is to look at who tends to be more vulnerable. So when trauma happens, to look at who's more impacted so that clinically we can assist them better. But also in the past few years, we've been looking at who does better under stress and what are those protective factors so that hopefully we can change our educational system to include those. So instead of just fixing what's wrong, promoting what is right. So, you've been hearing a lot probably that wellness is not merely the absence of illness. So it's sort of the same concept. Is it working, Jocelyn?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you. See how resilient we all are. So just to make sure, because I'm sure you heard the definition of well-being for the past couple of days, just to make sure that everyone knows exactly what stress is, because what I hope to tell you today is that stress is actually the best thing that has happened to our human species to survive. Although sito بالسوق للstress منزوع. So we think very poorly of it, but it's a quite interesting thing to look at. So basically, what is stress? It's a perceived imbalance between environmental demands on one hand and personal resources on the other. So whenever environmental demands increase, okay, and during the past couple of years, طبعا نرجع كتير لورا بتاريخ لبنان, we've had an increase, whether it's with COVID, whether it's with the financial devaluation, صار في كتير ضغط. So demands to adjust to a new situation. وبالمقابل, the personal resources have depleted. Okay, so in terms of money, time, education, connection, كل هدول الريسورسز اللي عادة عنا إياهم خفوا. دونك بنصير نحس إنه في stress. So there's in absolute value, no single event is stressful, but when the demands are higher than the resources. يعني تناخد example بسيط, if it's an exam that you're sitting for, if you have enough time, then the exam is less stressful. If you're the professor, like myself, sitting on the other side of exams, then they're not stressful at all, right? So the idea of stress is that there's an imbalance between the environmental demands and the personal resources. The key word here is perception. It's perceived imbalance. في عنا مثل باللبناني بيقول بيشوف مصيبة غيره بتهون مصيبته. Let me show you what this means from a scientific perspective. Now, ideally, when you look at this picture, okay, what do you see? Some of you might see faces looking at each other, right? And others might see a vase. Now, whether you are focusing on the face or on the vase, your brain activation, so the part of your brain that processes this information, is going to be completely different. So the perception or the idea that we can have different interpretation of the same, يعني الصورة هي ذاتها, okay? But we interpret it in different ways. This is exactly what is going to define who is more on the traumatic stress spectrum and who is more on the growth spectrum. But let me tell you something, كمان as a disclaimer من الأول. Once you know that you are biased in the way you perceive, it doesn't mean that it's automatically going to change. كمان you've heard lots of presentations about what can you do to improve well-being, but this doesn't mean that once you know, خلاص تظبط الوضع. Okay, you have to do an extra effort to override some automatic perceptions that you have. Okay, let me tell you what you're seeing, what you're looking at. So basically, those are two drawings. If I ask you which horizontal line, يعني أي خط هون أطول, is it this one or this one? The one on top or the one below?
Same.
And obviously, because I told you that this is a bias, you don't need to take my word for it. So let me show you that they're actually the same. Okay, but if I remove those dotted lines, which one your brain automatically think is bigger? The one on top. مظبوط? Okay, so even if you know إنه هن they're the same, you're still seeing them as if الفوقاني أكبر. And this is because when it comes to stress, there are some evolutionary biases. Okay, so the way our brain works is biased towards threat. So تنحمي حالنا evolutionary من كتير مخاطر تعرضنا لها كهيومن سبيشيز عبر آلاف ومئات آلاف السنين. دماغنا صار hypersensitive لكل شيء stress وتروما. So whenever we're in the presence of stress and trauma, there's an automatic response quite like this one. So هيدي صورة مبسطة كتير عن شو هن البايسز يلي نحن بنستعملهم to process trauma. ويلي منهم صح أو غلط. Okay, هيدا نحن موديلنا هيك بيجي مركب. So we're going to talk about how can we decrease the bias. We're not going to be able to erase it. So when it comes to trauma, أول ما بلشنا نحكي عن التروما ونفكر شو هو التروما, we tended to define trauma as if it's an exception. إنه هيدا حدث exceptional بيصير بتاريخ حياتنا. Now we know that we need to redefine the trauma. We talk about big T traumas, and we're going to be talking about a few, and I'm sure a few more come to your mind if I ask you about them. So we talk about big T traumas عن الكوارث الكبيرة إذا بدكم. Okay, besides the ones اللي رح نحكي عنهم اليوم, there are traumas related to road accidents, natural disasters, wars, displacement. هول بنسميهم big T traumas, يعني traumas عظيمين كبار. وفي ترومايات صغطورين بس دماغنا بيتعامل معهم بذات الطريقة. Okay, so the small T traumas are examples of bullying. حدا قالنا شيء كلمة بشعة, ما بنستاهلها، استاذ تمسخر علينا قدام الصف او قصصنا بطريقه non justified. كل هدول بنسميهم small t traumas. so اذا بنعدهم كلهم سوا we come to realize انه in our lifetime every single one of us in this room is going to be dealing with trauma at some point in our life. So it's no longer considered, you know, it's the exception. We consider it inherent to human life. يعني صار كأنه من شيء من الحياة. Okay, منه شيء exceptional بيصير. Now, the talk today is focusing on شو بيصير فينا من بعد ما نعيش صدمة. How do we process these traumas? Why are some of us more vulnerable than others? So I'm going to show you a series of small, as I said, research that my team and I conducted over the past few years in Lebanon. And the collective traumas that we're going to be focusing on have to do with the uprising in October 2019, the repercussion of which بعده مكمل. So المشكلة بهول التروماز أولاً إنه they're collective، يعني بيطالوا كذا حدا بذات الوقت. وتاني شغلة إنه الارتدادات تبعهم بعدها مكملة. Okay, obviously the COVID من أول 2020, the financial devaluation that worsened in May of 2020, and it seems like a lifetime ago, the Beirut port explosion in August of that same year. بس الارتدادات تبع كل هيدول برجع بقول بعدهم مكملين، وهيدي المشكلة يلي عم تخلي الويل بينج تبعنا هالقد مهدد. اوكي، وصولا اخيرا وليس اخرا من كم شهر a series of earthquakes يلي صارت بالمنطقة. So اول study رح فرجيكم results تبعها هي in times of political uprising and socio-economic uncertainty شو بتكون عادة ردة فعل العالم. So what we've done is collect data in February of 2020. So بس رجعكم بالزمن شوي لورا. This was around the time وين صار في ثقة لثقة، حكومة مش حكومة، بس actually الحكومة حسن دياب أخذت الثقة. اوكي، بس كان في بعد مظاهرات شعبية ومطالبة بإسقاطها. So بهيدا الكلايمت we've asked around 500 mostly college students يعني طلاب جامعات about their opinion on many different things. And in case كمان you're not very familiar, in psychology we have like measurement tools, so scales. كيف منروح عند بالبيت منزين حالنا او منروح عند لاب تناخد تنعمل بلاد تيست. هول السايكومتريك تيست تقريبا بيفرجونا similar aspects، بمعنى انه we can measure anxiety, we can measure فينا نقيس depression، فينا نقيس مين الناس يلي ما بيحبوا الكلايمت of uncertainty. في ناس كتير بيحبوا يعرفوا كل شيء مخطط بحياتهم، في ناس ما عندهم مشكلة they tolerate انه we have a certain degree of uncertainty. We've also measured things like coping and resilience. And we tried to see مين العالم، مين هن هالشباب والصبايا يلي عندهم a higher sense of well-being. So obviously it came as no surprise, but this is a good thing because, you know, science is evidencing the common sense that you might guess. إنه بمقدار ما عنا anxiety أكتر، so بمقدار ما نحن أشخاص بنعتى الهم أكتر بclimate political uncertainty، أوكي، ثورة، مظاهرات، instability، الويل بينج تبعنا مهدد أكتر. بمقدار ما نحن عنا مشاكل depression، المود تبعنا مش كتير ظابط، أوكي، obviously بمقدار ما الويل بينج تبعنا كمان بيكون مهدد أكتر، وبمقدار ما نحن ما بنتحمل إنه ما نعرف بكره شو في. هلا رح تقولوا لي انه صرنا من 2020 اوكي وصاروا 3 سنين وبعدنا لليوم ما عرفنا، وهذا اكيد مش طبيعي. وانا I'm not asking for this to be like the normal standard انه يلا 3 years الله ما بنعرف الله وين اخذنا، اوكي، بس او المسؤولين عنه الله ما خصه in that case. But I mean there are some of us who tolerate this uncertainty better than others, and obviously we tend to do better in terms of well-being. So when we do not tolerate uncertainty, we tend to have lower well-being scores. Also, not surprisingly, بذات الظرف, okay, ذات الشباب والصبايا, under the same, faced with the same uncertainty, with the same unknown, بيسافروا ما بيسافروا, بيبقوا بالبلد, بكره رح يكون احسن مش احسن, اوكي. دونك بظل ذات الظروف العالم يلي عندهم resources اكثر, يلي they're capable of positive coping, يعني مثلا عندهم hobbies اكثر, بيعملوا سبار اكثر, بيناموا احسن. هلا نحن نرجع نحكي شوي عن هيدول البيهيفيرز. عندهم social support system اكبر, بيعرفوا يفصلوا براسهم بين شو هو الدايركت ثريت وشو هو الاندايركت ثريت. Okay, so people who are able to cope بالطرق المنيحة وبالطرق الأقل منيحة. وتقول أقل منيحة يعني يلي بيدخنوا شوي أكتر وبيشربوا شوي أكتر وبيركوا على الشوكولا شوي أكتر مثل ما حكينا هالكام يوم الأخرين. Okay, they tend to do better in terms of well-being. And those of us, much like the Phoenix, who have higher scores of resilience, also tend to do better. So that's when it comes to political uprising. أكيد نحن بلبنان عم نصارع accumulation, يعني تراكمات تبع كل هيدول سوا. But it's interesting to see إنه بظل ذات الظروف في ناس ممكن تقدر تتأقلم, وبنحكي عن post traumatic growth, وفي ناس ممكن تعيش distress أكبر. أوكي, وبنحكي عن post traumatic stress. عملنا تقريبا ذات الشيء أول ما بلش الكوفيد. كمان تذكركم لأنه هلأ كوفيد الحمد لله مع إنه it's still circulating, but we tend to think of it as a regular flu now, and our lives are very different from what they were in May of 2020. So let me remind you, in March of 2020, in case أنتم مثلي goldfish memory وصرنا نضيع بالداتات, in March of 2020 الحكومة اللبنانية أعلنت حالة الطوارئ القصوى من وراء الكورونا, وسكر حدود لبنان, وأعلن a very strict quarantine and lockdown. والكوارنتين كانت 14 نهار, يعني كان الشخص يلي بينصاب بكورونا بينحجر جمعتين, وأشغالنا مدارسنا حياتنا كلها توقفت, and we went for 3 months of very strict lockdown. اوكي, دونك انحجرنا, انحبسنا, او في ناس قالت انه لا we were safe at home. back in the day, so كمان بماي 2020 كنا نعد حالات الكورونا بالنقايطة, يعني اليوم في 1, اليوم في 10, اليوم في 5, اليوم في 6, وكنا to track daily بأي مناطق عم بيصيروا الإصابات. So بهيدا الظرف كمان we've asked around 350 young adults كمان عن how were they doing. So سألناهم عن الستريس, عن الانكزايتي, عن الدبريشن, وعن البي تي اس دي. لأن بدي أقول لكم إنه الكوفيد كمان هو واحد من الأشياء يلي بينعد من الصدمات النفسية الكبيرة. partly هو لأنه ما حدا كان عايش أو ما حدا عاشر شيء بيشبه الكورونا بتاريخ حياته. أوكي, سو بالآخر 100 سنة ما بعرف إذا في ناس بيناتنا معمرين أكثر من 100 أو قرايبنا, بس بآخر 100 سنة ما صار مثل الكورونا. alright, so this is partly why we consider that COVID is a major source of trauma. But the tweak here, الفرق أو المفارقة, is that we've decided to look into protective factors, and we looked at sleep and gratitude. So concept نام بكير وقوم بكير, we wanted to test it. Now what we found is that unsurprisingly, and the numbers are quite scary if you think of them, 85% of the people, of the young adults that we've asked, have reported a source of distress. يعني وحدة من هيدول, stress, anxiety, depression. 85%. Okay, so every 10 people تقريبا 2.5, يعني 9 أشخاص على 10 have reported some kind of distress. What does this tell us? This tells us actually that adjusting to changes that are so dramatic comes at a very high price. So مع إنه بلشنا كلنا نعمل يوغا ونتعلم طبخ, كل واحد منكم أكيد بيخبرنا إنه بها أول فترة الكورونا, أول مرة انحجرنا من الكورونا, we try to, learn new things, make it fun, have like happy hours with friends or virtual coffee online. So although we tried this, the distress مثل ما قلنا انه the environmental demands وقتها بيزيدوا كتير والresources تبعنا بيخفوا, we fall into the trap of maladaptive stress. So هو بمطلق الحياة stress is a good thing, but when it becomes chronic and when it's very intense مثل بحال الكورونا, obviously it backfires. And this is exactly what we've noticed. Now there are a category of people who do less well. So women as opposed to males were doing less well during the COVID lockdown. Those who had lost their jobs or who were looking for jobs, يعني يلي كان عندهم financial insecurity. So نعرف that financial security, أو العلم بيقلنا at least, that the financial security is an important cornerstone of our well-being. And people might have touched upon this in the past talks or conferences during this wellness week. And also people who are younger. Typically, people who are between 15 and 25 or 18 and 25 were those who did less well during COVID. Obviously, the reason why is that because people within this age group, they thrive by going out, experimenting in the world, learning new things, meeting other people, and all of these were not possible during the lockdown. But what I'm here to tell you is not just to talk about why most of us were doing poorly during COVID lockdown. It's to tell you that those of us who managed to sleep better in terms of sleep quantity, يعني عدد ساعات النوم, and sleep quality, يعني نوعية النوم. Now I'm not shaming Netflix لأنه صرنا كلنا ما فينا نظهر, so قاعدين كل النهار قدام التلاقة مع السوشيال ميديا, so بدل ما ننام على الساعة 12. The manufacturer of smartwatches reported انه بالعالم كله the time to bed shifted by 1.5 hours. يعني اللي كانوا عادة يروحوا يناموا على 10 صاروا يروحوا يناموا على 11 ونص, يروحوا يناموا على 12 صاروا يروحوا يناموا على 1 ونص. So there was a global shift in the sleep patterns, and obviously this worsened mental health. Whereas those who slept better and who practiced gratitude, who were still finding reasons to be grateful, who were locked down with friends, with roommates they liked, with husbands, wife that they appreciated, with kids that they liked, they were doing better than others, again, under the same strict COVID lockdown. Now we've done the same thing لأنه COVID ضل ملزق لفترة كتير طويلة. We've done the same thing, the exact same thing, exact same assessment 1 year afterwards. أول مرة we've done this in May 2020, تاني مرة in May 2021. هلا بهالوقت كان already صار في financial crisis يلي مرق فيها لبنان, already كانت وصلت لمراحل صعبة. الدولار بوقتها كان حوالي 10,000. هلا بنضحك when we think of it, انه نضحك نبكي ما بعرف. وكان already صار انفجار المرفأ. donc obviously كان صار في already تراكمات من القصص. بس الأهم هيدا this was a question that we had, انه بماي 2020 عدد الوفيات للكوفيد كان كتير 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 قليل, و90% من العالم ما كان, أو 95% من العالم they had not yet lost anyone to COVID. Whereas in May 21, 85% of the people had actually lost someone close to them due to COVID. يعني عدد الوفيات للكورونا كان وصل لأرقام كتير عالية. كمان خليني بس أذكركم إنه بماي 2021 بعد ما كنا توصلنا للفاكسين تبع الكوفيد, يعني بعدين صار عنده راوند 1 وراوند 2 وكل الكونسبيرسي ثيوريز حواليه. بعد بماي 2021 كان في promises إنه معقول نوصل لفاكسين, بس كان صار لنا سنة بنتنقل مع ماسكات. كنا بلشنا نظهر, سو بأول 2021 كان كمان صار فيه من بعد الأعياد, كان كمان صار فيه لوك داون كتير ستريكت لكم شهر. alright, سو هيدا الإطار العام بس أذكركم. دونك سؤالنا كان, طب إذا من سنة العالم هالقد كان they're struggling with mental distress, من بعد سنة هالقد تراكم عليهم أشياء, انفجار مرفأ, financial crisis, خسروا ناس بيحبون, so very severe, وما قدروا يصلوا عليهم مثل ما عادة بيصلوا, ما قدروا وقفوا حد بعضهم مثل ما عادة بيوقفوا. شو يا ترى وين صاروا أرقام mental distress. We are not the only team of research who have actually found that the numbers were unsurprisingly the same. يعني العالم يلي تأثروا أول مرة من ارتدادات وتداعيات اللوك داون تبع كورونا هن ذاتهم يلي كانوا بعدهم عم بيعانوا، بس مش إنه ناس زيادة صاروا عم بيعانوا. And this is a very puzzling finding. It's a very interesting finding لأنه مثل كأنه وصلنا لبلاتو. هلا مش معناتها انه تمسحنا وقد ما زادوا الضربات ما بقى حدا يتاثر. Okay, this is absolutely not that. وراح فرجيكم exactly why this is not the case. Now, what we have measured on the positive spectrum is, as you can see, gratitude هي ذاتها. Okay, and we've measured post-traumatic growth يلي عم نحكي عنه من اول لقائنا اليوم، يلي هو امكانيه النمو من بعد الصدمه. So to use this change, massive change, to drive positive change in our personal lives. So what we saw is that the percentage of mental distress was exactly the same. Now, out of 85% of people who were distressed, okay, a third, one third, يعني 1 in 3, had actually severe forms of distress. Donc, المعاناة تبعهم كانت عن جد كتير severe. باقي العالم كانوا حاسين مضغوطين, but they're still able to function. Also, perhaps not surprisingly, but still interesting to mention, when we asked people, انتوا عم بتعانوا يا ترى اكثر من الفاينانشال كرايسيس، من تداعيات انفجار المرفأ او من كورونا؟ وبرجع بقول لكم كمان بوقتها كورونا ما كان عنده فاكسينيشن وكنا اوريدي خسرنا unfortunately كثير ناس لكورونا. العالم most people actually rated انه the financial concern were more pressing than either the explosion or the COVID pandemic. So this is interesting كمان to see in the way we function, in the way we manage, in the way we run our daily lives, our concern are not necessarily directed to the primary source of distress. إنه المصاري ما رح تقتلنا, okay, and yet we worry about it more. versus الكوفيد يلي بوقتها كان عم بيقتل كثير من الناس اللي من أحبائنا, يلي كان عم بيعطلنا هم أقل. والانترستينج اكثر هو انه العالم يلي تاثروا ب either المشاكل الماديه او الانفجار او الكورونا هن يلي اكثر شيء they managed to grow. So let me take a minute to explain this so that it's clear to all of you. Those who were initially the most distressed managed to grow the most. And this is a very interesting finding that resonates with what other scientists across the world have already reported. So growing after a trauma doesn't mean انه انا ما بتاثر، انه انا صار انفجار المرفأ ما تاثرت شخصيا، ما مات لحدا يعني ما بتاثر. هيدي مش هي الميزه يلي بتخليني to grow من بعد صدمه و to say انه انا I want to stay in this country, I want to rebuild my life here. Same thing applies to COVID. مش يلي آخر همه مش قاطع الكوفيد من حده هو يلي they managed to do better under the lockdown. It's actually the people who are most distressed يلي أكثر شيء انزعجوا من الكوفيد, بس يلي كان عندهم resources, يلي كان عندهم مقومات social, personal, intellectual, spiritual, هول هن exactly يعني يلي انصدم أكثر شيء بالأول هو اللي أكثر شيء عنده حظوظ to be able to grow. And this is exactly why we are taking the time this afternoon to talk about post-traumatic growth, because I want you to know that if you were traumatized by any of the events I mentioned or any other events, then you have the most chances of using this distress to grow after a trauma. We've also asked ourselves بمعموعة الكورونا هيدي, تعرفوا في ناس أكتريتنا perhaps تحكي عن حالي I was safe at home, okay, مع عائلتي مع أولادي. We adjusted, صرنا نعرف نستعمل زوم من بعد ستريس بالأول, صرنا نعرف نستعمل زوم, وهلأ مثل يلي خلصنا حياتنا اليوم Teams, okay, WebEx, كل هيدول القصص. We started teaching online, doing business online. So we started innovating on this new reality that COVID imposed. So the question was the following. إذا عنا students عمرهم ذات الشيء, Okay, some of them are safe at home. عم بيدرسوا عم بيكملوا حياتهم online, yoga, cooking classes, كذا مذا online, versus students, medical residents, nursing students عم بيروحوا على الفرونت لاينز تبع الكورونا. كمان بدي ارجع اذكركم انه بال 2020 when we collected the data بعد ما كان عندنا the perspective of a vaccine against COVID. اكيد تتذكروا صور rescuers تبع الصليب الاحمر يلي كانوا يظهروا ملفلفين من فوق لتحت بهول الكيس الايسوليتنج بي بي ايز على كل اورجانس كانوا يطلعوا عليها. تتذكروا انه كنا نتبهدل اذا حدا عنده كيس كورونا ندبر له محل بشي اورجانس بشي مستشفى. right? So بهيدا الظرف we asked the same students, so عمرهم ذات الشيء، تطلعاتهم همومهم بالحياة هن ذاتهم. اوكي، توقعنا مثل ما probably some of you expect انه يلي قاعد safe at home chilling على نتفليكس on social media عم بيحضر شوية classes online كذا is gonna be doing better than those يلي اضطروا يغيروا completely حياتهم. So ال health care providers, medical residents, النيرسز يلي اكيد بنوجه لهم اكبر تحيه، الريسكيورز الصليب الاحمر يلي كانوا اوقات ما يرجعوا على بيتهم تما يعرضوا يلي عايشين معهم بالبيت لخطر. توقعنا انه هيدول لانه عم بيعيشوا ذات الازمه الماليه بس بلس عندهم ازمه صحيه مباشره، هن they are the frontline workers, healthcare workers، انه هن يكون الليفلز of well-being تبعهم اكبر. And of course I'm telling you this because what we found is exactly the opposite. And it was actually, ironically, but very understandably, okay, those students who were supposedly safe at home, who had the highest level of anxiety, the highest level of depression, the highest level of PTSD, and you might have also heard of the term burnout يلي هو الاحتراق المهني، مع انه هن يعني ironically okay ما عم بيحترقوا شيء، قاعدين ببيتهم. But and the lowest levels of well-being. Now if we take a minute to think of this, it might make sense لأنه rescuers, the healthcare providers, they were feeling useful under stress. They were feeling like they had the power of control. They were feeling like they were contributing. بينما الشباب الباقيين يلي انزربوا بالبيت ما حللوها. The perception was not إنه cool أنا I'm safe at home. The perception was إنه damn it I'm stuck at home, I'm imprisoned at home، ما فيي أظهر. So برجع بقول لكم هالفئة العمرية 18-25 هي اللي عادة بتظهر أكثر شيء بتختبر الحياة in contact with others as opposed to in contact with books or social media. So this is exactly the age group that struggled most. And again, surprisingly, it struggled even more than the healthcare providers يلي هن إذا منفكر مين معرضة حياته أكثر، هن أكيد healthcare providers كانوا بخطر. وفعليا unfortunately بلبنان وبباقي العالم we lost many healthcare providers حكمة ونرسات because or due to the COVID infection. Two more things I want to share with you today. Two more studies. One directly related to the Beirut explosion. And again, I don't want this to be triggering to any of you. بعرف إنه الارتدادات مع إنه صارت من أكثر من سنتين they're still pressing unfortunately. And don't ask me why. I was trying to exactly pinpoint when did the explosion happen. And it turned out that it was 1,000 days ago, day for day. So that تتسلوا تعدوا, and please don't do that. عدوا الاشياء الحلوه بحياتكم. اكيد this is what all the speakers are telling you بهيدا الwellness week. Okay, we want you to be counting blessings, but it's 1,000-day post trauma, and it's important for us to understand كيف كانت ردة فعلنا لهيدي المرحله الصعبه. So in November يعني من بعد 3-4 أشهر من الانفجار المرفأ, we asked around 1,300 individuals, which is quite a large sample. مقيمين بلبنان mostly بس كمان برات لبنان، مقيمين ببيروت وبرات بيروت، شباب وأقل شبابا. We asked them to say whether they agreed or disagreed on some statements that we gave them. And the tweak in this experiment is that we actually measured reaction time. So عيرنا لهم قد ايه بياخدوا وقت تيجاوبوا على كل سؤال. الفكره هون هي انه اذا بسالكم مثلا شو اسمكم you're gonna be very rapid in answering. اوكي هلا you're answering yes no. So اذا بقول اسمك مريم yes no is very rapid لان I'm certain انه this is my personal name, right? But if I ask you are you liking this presentation, regardless if your answer is yes or no, if you hesitate إذا بتاخدوا وقت أكتر تجاوبوا, it means that you're hesitating. Okay, regardless if you're very confident of yes or no. So actually هيدي الطريقة بتسمح لنا إذا بدكم to measure the implicit spontaneous attitudes of people. And what we found is that we can cluster most people in 3 big segments. Those who are still okay من بعد 4 أشهر extremely distressed, those who are extremely dissatisfied with the country. Donc صار في انفجار. العتب مش على أو الهم الأساسي مش من وراء تداعيات الانفجار but rather عتب على الدولة على الحكومة على المنظمات على الorganization تبع البلد. they're very pessimistic about the future. وجزء أخير a third of the people who are actually less distressed. And I want to tell you that those who are less distressed, they are not, so let me say this again, they are not the ones who are safe from the explosion. So this cluster includes people who have lost friends, property during the explosion. And I want to show you a bit more in details what these clusters look like. So people who are highly distressed, they're actually very dissatisfied with the country. Again, they have a very prominent job security issue مع انه ما حدا منهم كان خسر شغله. Okay, but they had the threat يعني عندهم هم هاجس انه يخسروا شغلهم. And they turned to media for comfort. They were mostly younger people, mostly female students who had, as we said, financial issues and who lived in proximity to the trauma. And what this tells us, or it reminds us, that the media, so for those of you in com art or in journalism, please bear in mind that what you share on social media, and those of you who consume social media, please know that what you read and what you expose yourself to actually influences the way you perceive an event. So those who turn for media or who turn to media for support, for comfort, صرنا كل تكن نشيك social media بوقتها, okay, right after this happened. And this was 4 months after, مش إنه بساعة الساعة, understandably, you're trying to understand what happens. Okay, this is 4 months, you're still looking online for answers as to what happened. So it has a negative effect and it worsens your experience. Also, we found that people who had no personal loss يعني ما تأثروا بالتروما عندهم highest country dissatisfaction. So bear in mind إنه من أقل من سنة قبلها كانت بلشت سلسلة التحركات الشعبية والانتفاضات بأكتوبر يلي وصلت للأبوجيه تبعها ابتداء من أكتوبر 2019. These people, so يلي أساساً هن مش طايقين البلد, these were those cluster included those people with a lack of sense of community. وهيدا الشيء كتير مهم لأنه رح تشوفوا إنه واحد من أهم عناصر الريزيلينس بالشعب اللبناني أو بالفينيكس يلي وصفناه بالأول هي the sense of community. يعني people coming together. And these were the people who had the lowest faith, lowest spirituality, and lowest levels of optimism. And this tells us, or it reminds us, that the trauma doesn't only cause the mental distress, it worsens pre-existing tendencies. يعني those of us يلي أساساً عندهم مشاكل financial, social, medical, personal وبنتعرض لهيدول التروما, so الكورونا, انفجار المرفأ, المشاكل المادية, we tend to do less well. This is also a reminder that, and I'm sure you've heard this a lot, that mental health is not to be dissociated from socioeconomic factors, from social situation, and from medical health. And the last group of people, so those who actually managed to do well after the Beirut blast, and I know that this sounds ironic, and I don't mean it as this. I don't mean to say that these are people إنه ما فرقانة معهم. They were less overwhelmed, يعني تأثروا كتير بانفجار المرفأ بس they were not overwhelmed, okay, and they were not traumatized. They were least dissatisfied with the country. So هول أقل عالم سألناهم إذا you want to leave قالوا yes. So هول هن العالم لأنه بتعرفوا ironically مش بس الانفجار دمر العاصمة، الانفجار دمر نفسيات العالم وبخاصة الشباب يلي basically متكلين عليهم to rebuild. Donc this is a very major, a very big problem. And so those who managed to still find things to appreciate in the country, those who had the strongest community resilience, and when I say community, it means that either with your classmates بالصف, either with a group that you belong to كشافة صليب أحمر في كتير جمعيات بننشط فيها, those who had who turned to faith, to spirituality for comfort. These were the people who were able to give a meaning to the aftermath, يعني ما بعد الانفجار, and still be grateful for the daily lives in this country. And this reminds us that as phoenixes, resilience is a community-based issue, and we don't necessarily need, من بعد كل صدمة, we don't only need, let me put it this way, professional interventions. عسلامتهم الprofessionals, I'm one of them. Okay, but what people mostly need is someone to give meaning to what we have collectively lived through, and for communities to come together. جيران يوقفوا حد بعضهم، رفقة، أصحاب, etc. The last thing I want to tell you before wrapping up is you've probably heard that the most or one of the very vulnerable age groups is actually adolescents. And I want to show you something that is fast forward to very recent times. And this is supposed to be November 22. Sorry, I apologize for the typo. What we did is we've worked with the Ministry of Education and Higher Education, so with MEHE, ورحنا على مدارس رسمية. أكيد كلكم تعرفوا ظروف المدارس الرسمية. And what we've actually done is a training on emotional intelligence. Okay, so we went for 10 sessions, one session every week, to students who are in grade 10 to 12, يعني seconde, première, terminale. And we actually taught them about emotional intelligence, stress management, positive communication, peaceful communication, etc. And what we interestingly found is that you can learn to regulate your anxiety, your depression, but also your trauma. And these emotional intelligence trainings and these stress management, they actually increase post-traumatic growth, and they mostly increase sense of well-being for these young adolescents. So I want to show you that there are things that you can do. يعني مش إنه once you are traumatized, خلاص there's nothing that you can do. You can teach. This is a skill. So مثل ما نتعلم نمشي وناكل ونقعد, فينا نتعلم how to manage our emotions and how to regulate our traumas. Now, if I want to bring this into a theoretical framework and go back to some slides that you've probably been exposed to earlier during this amazing wellness week, is that we have two brains: an emotional brain that is in the center of your brain, that is uncontrollable, and then a rational brain that is the controllable one. Now, there is no good guy, bad guy here. Both of them are amazing. We need both of them to make decisions. What happens when we're exposed to trauma is that the emotional brain becomes hyperactive, ومنقول دوا راسي, and this is why بيطلع صوتنا بلا قصدنا, منعيط, منصرخ, أو بيصير في كتير من تصرفاتنا عنفية بلا ما نقدر نسيطر عليها. And this is exactly why it happens. And the rational brain, مثل ما بنقول باللبناني سكر راسي, becomes less functional, so hypofunctional. Okay, and this leads to exactly what we say in سنبدنة. So people start having increased heart rate, نقزتهم بتصير هينة, في كتير منا آخر 3 سنين الأوجاع زادت, وجع راس, وجع ظهر, وجع مفاصل, الاميونيتي تبعنا, so المناعة تبعنا خفت. And you know, this is exactly what we find when we scan brains, and I promised you very few slides on the brain, so these are my 2 slides. This is exactly what we find when we look into the brain of traumatized people. So again, the amygdala is hyperactive, and this is exactly in the center of your brain. Okay, and it's in red, يعني it's hyperactive. And the part of your brain that usually regulates it, the rational brain, is not working. So ما فينا نركز، ما بنحفظ منيح، علاماتنا بتتراجع، بيطلبوا منا قصص بننسيهم. اوكي، قدرتنا على الاختيار بتصير كتير مهدده. And we tend to do these three things. I'm sure you've heard fight, flight, or freeze. And this is the automatic response when you are under stress. So you do either one of them. When you are traumatized, you're more likely to do one of those. So fight, يعني you become more aggressive. Flight, يعني you run away, you escape, you avoid. People leave the country, they give up. Okay, or freeze, يعني مننكت على حالنا انه, or basically this is what we mean وقت بنقول منتمسح. Okay, so basically we freeze. So الحل هو to restore the control by decreasing emotional brain activity and increasing rational brain activity. And as I showed you, and as the research supports, there are very few things that you can do. Okay, very easy behaviors like improve your sleep hygiene and practice gratitude daily, and mostly find solace within the community. So volunteer with friends of yours, with community of yours, with university of yours. And this is exactly what Antonine University has been promoting for the past couple of days. And that's my last slide. And if I want to wrap up and leave you with a take-home message, to answer the question, can the phoenix still rise? 4 billion years, billion, okay, منا غلط الرقم. 4 billion years have a history of evolution has told us or shown that we are wired to rise. So هيدا سيستم ردة الفعل على الصدمة النفسية is wired in our brains. We are wired to rise from trauma. The last 3 to 5 million years, and this is how long human beings have been circling on this planet, we understood that we can choose how to rise. So as opposed to our ancestors, يلي اجوا قبلنا, we are equipped with a part of the brain that allows us to choose things in our lives. So we can choose to go to bed early, we can choose to volunteer, we can choose to practice gratitude, and we can choose to come together as a community. Now, oh, and this resonates with كمان Lebanese sayings like تفاءلوا بالخير تجدوه. So now you know that changing your perception changes the way your brain is wired. And there's another very interesting saying that my grandpa always used to say, جنب بلا ناس ما بتنداس. So this is exactly it. The more lonely you are, the less likely you are to grow from a trauma. Now, what 6,000 سنة بهالشرق بلبنان, what they have told us is that we live in a part of the world where trauma is inherent. So هيدي منا أصعب مرحلة تعاش فيها لبنان. Okay, I'm sure إنه أهلينا وجدودنا عاشوا مراحل equally صعبة. But what I am showing you today is that although trauma is inherent, suffering from trauma is a choice, and growth is a possibility if you tap into your personal resources. Thank you.
Myriam, thank you, Mike. Thank you على البرزنتيشن.
A pleasure.
بدي اقول لك انه في تضارب في تضارب مؤخرين جدا انا وياهم. مريم اول شيء مشكوره انه اعطيك السيشن. مريم كان لازم تكون موجوده معنا بقلب الصاله، ولكن ابنها كثير مريض اضطرت تعطينا السيشن اونلاين. الشيء الانترستنج بهيدي بالورك شوب اللي عطيته انه الريسيرش معمول عندنا بلبنان باخر 2-3 سنين عشناهم. هلا يمكن لو تكون مريم معنا كان من بعد افضل اكيد، بس ما في كثير ريسيرش. مريم بتاكدي لي هذا الشيء بلبنان وعلى الشيء اللي بنعيشه، مشان بقى كثير انترستنج الشيء اللي خبرتينا اياه. انا بقول لك ثانك يو. ما بعرف اذا حدا عنده اي سؤال بهذا يسأل شيء، يستفسر عن شيء. عندك كان الصوت ما كان كثير عالي عنا، يعني صار في مشكله كمان، بس نحن نسمع كيف. طيب حدا عنده اي سؤال لمريم؟ انا بديك ثانك يو. سلامته ابني
Merci. Thank you for your flexibility and continuous resilience. Merci beaucoup.
الريزيلينس والادابتاسيون سريعه بقى خلي صار هيك. سلامتك قدامك
Thank you.
المرة الجاية نشوفك عندنا بقلب الجيم.
It would be a pleasure. Thank you so much.
اوكي ثانك يو لك. يلا باي.
Au revoir. Bye. Have a nice afternoon.